Coming up, the director of the U.S.'s Indian Energy Office joins us. Plus, how did Native candidates fare in Tuesday's primary elections? And what makes tribal elections unique? I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. A progress report was conducted on the Bureau of Indian Education on Tuesday. Various committees in the U.S. House convened a hearing to look at the policies and priorities of BIE. The hearing was fully virtual. Members of Congress spoke through spotty internet connections to get their questions across. A major topic of discussion was staffing at BIE schools. The education agency is currently deemed high risk by the federal government. One official testified that the agency has a current staff vacancy of 33%. The BIE director responded, saying his agency is working on the issue. He said recruiting staff for remote positions is an idea sprung from the pandemic.
When we classify a position that could be advertised remote. Guess what? We don't have to pull individuals from our tribal communities and have them report to an office somewhere that they don't want to live. We can actually set them up in their communities and have them as a remote employee and actually bring in people that know our communities, our cultures, our traditions, and know our tribes.
The Government Accountability Office said BIE can be removed from the high-risk list when it meets its 10 remaining recommendations. A religious official plans to apologize for historic abuses towards Indigenous people in Canada. Pope Francis's apology tour begins in late July and will focus on the abuses Indigenous children suffered at Catholic-run residential schools. More than 150,000 Native children in Canada were taken and forced to attend these schools from 1819 to 1978. Pope Francis will land first in Alberta, which is home to the largest number of former residential schools in Canada. His itinerary includes multiple meetings with Indigenous leaders. A rare Indigenous eyewitness account of the Battle of Greasy Grass has been found in a museum in Canada. The illustration depicts the battle, which took place in Montana on June 25th and 26th in 1876. A written account was also discovered in the Peel Art Gallery Museum and Archives. The letter comes from Lakota leader Standing Bear, who was just 17 years old when Lieutenant Colonel George Custer attacked. That battle, known by non-Lakota as the Battle of Little Bighorn, is celebrated as a victory for Indigenous people. These nations stood their ground and resisted their forced relocation onto reservations. Its anniversary is a recognized holiday among many nations. Standing Bear's letter and illustration about the historic battle was repatriated to his community. The Tahltan Nation has signed a consent-based agreement under the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act with the province of British Columbia. APTN's Lee Wilson has the details.
I'm deeply honored that we are the first Indigenous group in British Columbia to sign an agreement like this.
Tahltan Central Government President Chad Norman-Day shares his excitement over the signing of the first consent-based agreement under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act with the province of British Columbia. Tahltan territory is located in northern BC, makes up 11% of the province. The province started negotiations with the Tahltan in the summer of last year. BC Premier John Horgan says they are delivering on reconciliation while encouraging responsible investment in BC with this new agreement.
British Columbia is open for business in a collaborative way, in a sustainable way that starts and begins with the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to have a say and determine what happens on their territory and how we can go forward together in the interests of all British Columbians.
The agreement honors Tahltan jurisdiction and land management decisions in their territory, including the Eskay Creek Revitalization Project. The Eskay Creek mine operated in Tahltan territory from 1994 to 2008, and it was the highest grade producing gold mine in the world. But the Tahltan Nation say they never gave the consent for the mine to operate on their territory. Skeena Resources acquired the mine in 2020. They have been working with the Tahltan Nation to advance and reopen the Eskay Creek mine.
And so it's a very, very important step for the project and a foundational building block for the revitalization and the reopening of the Eskay Creek project.
The BC government says the consent-based agreement demonstrates successful collaboration with First Nations. The Tahltan central government stated they have been clear that even though their territory is mineral rich, there will be no mining without their stewardship around wildlife, fisheries, and environmental management.
It's extremely important that moving forward, Tahltan rights, Tahltan decisions, Tahltan values are at the heart of all of these projects. I often tell people that whether the government is orange or red or blue or green, the Tahltan Nation is always going to be covered in a lot of gold, silver, copper, and a lot of other minerals. So it's important that that we build these structures and that we do it properly.
Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Kitimat.
And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, we get primary election results from Oklahoma. But first, a Dene official from the Office of Indian Energy Policy joins us. Dene citizen Wahala Johns is the director of the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs. She is responsible for upholding and advancing her office's mission to develop and deploy energy solutions that benefit Native Americans and Alaska Natives. She joins us today to talk more about current projects and initiatives. Director Johns, thank you for joining the ICT Newscast.
Thank you, Leah.
So I want to start at a high level because you've been in office now for a few months. Tell us about the initiatives that you've been working on and are proud to report.
So there's been amazing initiatives coming out of the Biden administration. I was appointed about 16 months ago, and our charge is to help transition U.S. energy to 100% clean energy by 2035, and to also get to a net zero economy by 2050. And the Office of Indian Energy has been, fortunately, in the past 10 years, doing this work already with the program that has been in place that's supporting clean energy projects throughout Indian country and Alaska as well, and in really remote rural regions where these renewable energy systems are sort of thriving and saving a lot of money for tribes.
What does clean energy look like in Indian country? One of the most promising examples that stands out to me is solar.
Yes, solar, it could be wind, it could be geothermal, and a lot of the projects that we've supported are mostly renewable energy projects like microgrids and battery storage combined with solar PV and wind. And I think that, Indian country has been leading this effort for a really long time. And I know, due to climate change, we are trying to transition our energy systems towards a cleaner and renewable one. And I'm just really proud of tribal nations, taking the lead. And our role as Office of Indian Energy is to help with resources, funding opportunities, but also technical assistance. We have a lot of engineers that work within the Department of Energy that are helping tribes and communities to really be a part of this transformation and also create jobs and an economy. And I think that's the opportunity within Indian country is how can we expand to really make our communities and nations climate and energy resilient. And this is a huge goal for me is that, I think once we have our nation and our home and our communities, self-sufficient and self-reliant with renewable energy power, that's going to make us more stronger and less dependent on, other places for power, because we are seeing the severe impacts to grid, when it comes to freezing temperatures or fires and different, natural hazards that are impacting our national grid systems. And, many times disadvantaged communities or communities that, are in rural areas are primarily affected actually don't have the resources to recover quickly. But I do like our program because many of the tribes, these projects that they've been implementing are climate and energy resilient projects.
You mentioned funding for tribal nations. Maybe talk more about what funding opportunities are available.
So we just put out 2 notice of intents recently that we're going to be announcing funding opportunities in the next few weeks, hopefully. One is around our annual FOA that we usually release is to support energy infrastructure for clean energy projects. And the other, and that's for, I believe, 20 million. And the other funding opportunity that we'll be announcing is around unelectrified buildings. So tribal buildings, tribal buildings that are not connected to a grid. And so, as you know, there's been a lot of homes within Indian country that still don't have access to electricity. And so this funding opportunity would be geared towards those type of homes. So, and then we'll be announcing one more funding opportunity for specifically for tribal colleges and universities to move towards 100% clean energy.
As you mentioned before, clean energy is something that tribes are delving into now. What are some of the major barriers that tribal leaders talk to you about in terms of wanting to get into clean energy, but maybe they're finding some places where they're not seeing that happen right now?
There's over 574 tribal nations, tribal entities, Alaska Native villages, and corporations that, are all different and unique and have their own challenges. And I do think that some of the challenges that we've heard, we held a listening session last year with the Loan Programs Office at Department of Energy to talk about, some of the barriers, and some of the barriers are funding. And so we have been modifying like the cost share requirement that most grants, federal grants have, and our grant opportunities have been that we've done 50% cost share. And so we're able to lower that down to 20%, and we can go as low as 10%. So I'm really excited about that change. And the Loan Program Office actually has a huge opportunity of $2 billion of direct loan authority right now. So if there is huge, projects that tribal leaders are interested in pursuing and need a financing mechanism, they should contact the Loan Program Office. And there's a lot of information on the Department of Energy website. I think the other piece is that many times tribal nations don't have the staff or resources to even apply for grants. And so that's something that we have been also looking at and thinking about strategically. How can we be setting up tribes to really take part of this once in a generation investment in our energy systems? Right now, we have the bipartisan infrastructure law, $62 billion out of Department of Energy that will be going to strengthening our electrical grid and preparing our nation to be more self-reliant, self-sufficient. And I think tribes have a huge opportunity in this, and want to make sure, from our office, that we are providing those resources.
Well, Director Wahala Johns, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Six states held primary elections Tuesday. Those included Illinois, Colorado, Oklahoma, Utah, Mississippi, and New York. ICT's political correspondent, Polly Danette-Claus, fresh off of the hills of election night, and she joins us now. Polly, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaliyah.
So let's start in Oklahoma. What a night in Oklahoma. How did the candidates fare there?
You know, there were very few surprises in the Oklahoma race. You know, Governor Kevin Stitt, who is Cherokee, got nearly 70% of the votes. He's headed to the general election and is likely to win. In Oklahoma, Republican candidates who win are likely to win at the general election. So essentially, the folks who won in this election will most likely win at the general election this fall. So the other really surprising moment last night was Markwayne Mullen, who is a Cherokee, and he got almost 44% of the votes, and there were over a dozen candidates in that race. And so it's just it was shocking to see the high percentage of votes that Mullen got. And the other surprising part of that race is that both of the Republican candidates who are headed to the runoff in August 23rd, are both Indigenous. And so T.W. Shannon got the second highest votes with 17.54%. So he is also headed to the runoff election going up against Mullen. T.W. Shannon is from the Chickasaw Nation.
And that, of course, is very surprising. Well, I shouldn't say surprising. I should say it's significant because they're both running for positions in the U.S. Senate. And it's been a very long time since a Native person was in the Senate.
It's been since 2003, I believe, in Colorado when the last Indigenous person held a seat in the Senate. And so this is going to be a very important race to watch. The other race that happened was for Congressional District 2, and that had two Indigenous candidates, Guy Barker and Cherokee Councilman Wes Nofire. Guy Barker is also the Secretary Treasurer of the Quapaw Nation. So two Indigenous leaders from two different communities running for this seat. And Guy Barker did fairly well. He came in fifth place. He had about 11% of the votes. And the two who were going to go on to the runoff election in Oklahoma got around 15. And so it was a very close race. It's 15-13, and then the rest were all around sort of 11 for the top five. And Wes Nofire came in seventh, and he got about 6% of the votes. So it didn't do as well. But that was the Oklahoma Congressional District 2 race.
So just so I'm understanding correctly, the two Republican Indigenous candidates running to replace Congressman Markwayne Mullen in the U.S. House will not be going to the runoff election. So it's safe to say that Markwayne Mullen's empty seat won't be filled by a Native person.
Yes.
I want to move to the Oklahoma State Senate. Tell us what happened there, because there were a number of candidates who ran, of course.
Yes. So let me just check my notes here. So there were 8 state House representatives who ran unopposed, who are now just going directly to the general election. One of them is the lone Democratic candidate in Oklahoma who is Indigenous. That's A.J. Pittman from the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. And so she is the only Democratic candidate, Indigenous candidate in Oklahoma right now. And so she's headed to the general election. Brad Bowles, Herschel Trey Caldwell, Scott Fetgotten, I'm so sorry if I'm saying people's names wrong, by the way, Mike Osborne, John Pfeiffer, Mark Van Kuren, and David Hardin are all they all ran unopposed, and they're all headed to the general election. The two, Ken Luttrell and Mark McBride, who did have opponents in the Republican primary, got 64% of the votes. So they do not have to do the special election runoff. They're headed straight to the general election. And that is 11 who are running. Is it 11, 8, 9, 10? Yes, 11. 11 are running for the Oklahoma House.
You know, Polly, what strikes me is I think that in Oklahoma, maybe more than any other state in the country, there are a lot of Republican Indigenous candidates. It's hard to really talk about it in a broad way, but how closely do those Republican Indigenous candidates align themselves with former President Trump?
I will say that a lot of candidates from Oklahoma, especially who are running for national seats, support President Trump. I'm not as certain when it comes to state politicians, but definitely at the national level, they have either endorsed Trump or talked very highly of him.
And talking about a Trump endorsement, I mean, on a national conversation, that's something that so many people talk about. Are Mark Wayne Mullen or any other of the congressional candidates endorsed by President Trump?
I have not. I can't definitively say, but I wouldn't be surprised if he has.
Great. Well, let's move really quickly. We only have a short time here left. Let's move very quickly to Utah. What happened in Utah?
Yes. So Davina Smith, who is running in the Democratic primary, she's Navajo. She's running in Utah District 69, which is mostly public lands. It holds 5 of Utah's, most famous national monuments, including Bears Ears and the Arches. So she is, and also part of the Navajo Nation. I feel like that's very important to know that Utah Navajo is also included in District 69. And so she ran unopposed in the Democratic primary. And so she's headed to the general election this fall. She goes up against a Republican candidate who was pardoned by Trump. And so it's going to be a very exciting race to watch.
Absolutely. Well, Polly, thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaliyah.
It is election season all over the country, from national, state, and local offices to tribal governments. After last year's concerns over voter fraud, what steps will ensure that votes will be counted fairly? John Tasuda joins us to talk about tribal elections and what makes them unique. He's a partner with Navigators Global. Welcome back, John.
Thanks for having me back again.
So let's just delve right in. I mean, we're talking about tribal elections. What makes them unique?
Well, what makes them unique is probably the variety of constitutional provisions and election provisions that tribes have. If you look at federal and state elections, they're pretty similar, the way they're handled, the process and procedures that are in place. But tribes have a great variety, actually, in how their election processes are structured. And that leads to confusion by, people. A lot of challenges, as we know, happen to elections in Indian country. And slowly over time, I think the process is becoming a little more settled. And you have to keep in mind, there's also sort of the hangover of BIA involvement, for pretty much since reservation days and the start of the election of tribal officials. The BIA oversaw a lot of those elections, and that provision is written into a number of old constitutions that some tribes still use. So the Secretary of Interior actually has a handbook on running tribal elections and often gets called in either because it's required by a tribe's constitution, or sometimes tribes would like to have an independent, sort of a third party confirmation of the validity of the election. And the Secretary is authorized and will, if asked, fill in that role.
That really stands out to me because tribes, of course, are sovereign nations, and yet they're asking the federal government, hey, step in as a third party. Do you think that that's something that the BIA or the Interior Department should oversee?
Well, I would say in an ideal world, no. But again, for a lot of tribes, if you think about it in this context, we're still sort of evolving democracies. And so, again, some of these processes are not well established. They're not ingrained in people's minds, and people often like to have somebody explain to them, what is, the difference and why an election should be valid or not. And it plays, ultimately plays a valid role in that sense.
You mentioned that tribal elections all over Indian country are different according to what the tribe's constitutions or laws are like. And we're seeing places, I mean, the tribe that comes to mind for me is the Navajo Nation, where there are some provisions that candidates have to have in order to even be able to run. And famously, there was a candidate who didn't speak the Navajo language. And, that was a big topic of controversy. Maybe talk about what kinds of provisions that elections have and how we're going to see those evolve as we move into, more time as time moves forward, I should say.
Well, again, think about the uniqueness of tribes and our institutions. We often like to bring in or retain cultural elements. We think of them as traditional elements of our communities and stuff into our elections. And so that's, which is great, I think. It certainly retains, sort of the tribal feel for the election. But there does need to be sort of in our modern times, a way to conduct an election that can't be contested for discriminating against certain people or not being handled to prevent fraud, et cetera. I mean, those are always issues that get challenged in an election if there's a challenge, and then having a tribal court is also important so that the election can be have a place, a forum for it to be challenged. That's within the tribe's sovereignty, and so that's great. In a way, I think that we're moving more and more. Again, not all of these processes are ingrained, and some tribes are reluctant, to move, say, to a tribal court. Some tribes retain sort of the tribal membership as the ultimate authority to overturn or confirm an election. So but we've come a long ways, and we still have ways to go. Like I said, we're still evolving democracies in a lot of ways. And I just think that we do a great job in general of keeping sort of our traditional beliefs and values in a lot of things that we do. And we do that with elections too. And so I think that's one thing that really makes tribes unique.
Absolutely. Well, John Tasuda, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.